Sarah Mitchell had learned long ago that respect wasn't given freely. At 42 years old, she had spent 20 years in the Navy, 15 of those as a SEAL. She was one of the first women to complete the grueling training, and she carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. But on this warm September evening in Riverside, Texas, walking home from the grocery store, Sarah wasn't thinking about her service record. She was thinking about her daughter Emma's birthday cake and whether she'd remembered to buy candles. The sun was setting as she walked down Maple Street, her grocery bags hanging from both arms. Riverside was a small town, the kind where people still said hello to strangers and left their doors unlocked. Sarah had moved here 6 months ago, after her medical retirement from active duty. A training accident had left her with a limp and chronic pain in her left leg, but it hadn't broken her spirit. She didn't notice the group of young men until she was nearly upon them. 5 of them, probably in their early 20s, leaning against a pickup truck outside the old bowling alley. Beer cans littered the ground around their feet. "Well, well, what do we have here?" one of them called out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap backward. His voice carried that particular edge that comes from too much alcohol and not enough sense. Sarah kept walking, her eyes forward. She'd dealt with worse than drunk boys trying to impress each other. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The tall one pushed off from the truck and stepped into her path. His friends laughed, forming a loose semicircle around her. She stopped, setting down one grocery bag carefully. "Excuse me," she said calmly. "I'd like to pass." "Oh, she'd like to pass," another one mocked, his words slurred. "You hear that, boys? The lady wants to pass." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. 5 men, all larger than her 5'6" frame, all intoxicated, which made them unpredictable but also slower. The street was empty. The nearest house was at least 100 yards away. "Please move aside," she said, her voice steady and firm. The tall one stepped closer. She could smell the beer on his breath. "What if we don't want to? What are you going to do about it?" His hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Sarah's body tensed, every muscle ready, but she forced herself to remain calm. These were drunk kids, not enemy combatants. She didn't want to hurt them if she didn't have to. "Let go of my arm," she said quietly. Instead, he tightened his grip. "Make me sweetheart." His friends were emboldened now, moving closer. One of them reached for her other arm. Another kicked over her grocery bag, sending apples and oranges rolling across the pavement. "That's enough," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tone that had once commanded troops in hostile territory. "Last chance, step back." They laughed at her. The tall one's face twisted into something ugly. "Listen to this one, thinks she's tough." He shoved her backward and she stumbled, her bad leg nearly giving out. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. "The lady asked you to step back." The voice was deep, calm, and carried absolute authority. Sarah turned her head slightly. A man stood about 10 feet behind her. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in uniform. Even in jeans and a plain t-shirt, he radiated controlled power. The drunk men hesitated. Something in the newcomer's stance, in the way he held himself, gave them pause. "This ain't your business, old man," the tall one said, but his voice had lost some of its bravado. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm making it my business." He moved forward with the fluid grace of a trained fighter, positioning himself slightly to Sarah's right. "Now, I suggest you boys apologize to the lady and move along." "Or what?" one of the others challenged, puffing out his chest. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but to Sarah, it felt longer. She could see the calculation happening in the drunk men's eyes, the alcohol-fueled courage warring with their survival instincts. The tall one made his decision. "There's 5 of us and 2 of you, 1 old man and 1 woman," He spat on the ground. I like those odds. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as like watching a carefully choreographed dance, except real. The tall one threw the first punch at Gunnar. It was slow, telegraphed, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd learned to fight in bars rather than training rooms. Gunnar sidestepped it effortlessly, caught the man's extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into his nearest friend. Two down, tangled together on the ground. The other three rushed forward simultaneously. One went for Gunnar, two for Sarah. Sarah's body remembered what her mind sometimes tried to forget. 20 years of training took over. The first man who reached for her found his arm twisted and his face meeting the pavement before he understood what had happened. The second hesitated, which was his mistake. Sarah's elbow caught him in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, her knee came up, not hard enough to cause serious damage, but enough to send him to the ground. Meanwhile, Gunnar had efficiently dealt with his opponent. The man was on his knees, his arm locked behind his back in a hold that looked almost gentle, but was clearly causing significant pain based on the whimpering sounds he was making. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. The tall one scrambled to his feet, his face red with rage and humiliation. "You crazy!" He reached into his jacket, and Sarah's heart rate spiked. But before he could pull out whatever weapon he was going for, Gunnar had released his current prisoner and closed the distance. One precise strike to the wrist, and a knife clattered to the pavement. That, Gunnar said calmly, his foot moving to cover the knife, was a very stupid decision. The sound of sirens filled the air. Someone must have called the police. Sarah leaned against the wall of the bowling alley, her breath coming fast, her bad leg throbbing. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and with it came the familiar pain. Gunnar noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes still tracking the 5 men who had formed a nervous cluster near their truck. "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically. Then more honestly, "Old injury, it acts up." He nodded in understanding. "Got a few of those myself." 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. Officer Tom Bradley stepped out of the first one. Tom was in his 50s, had lived in Riverside his whole life, and knew almost everyone in town. "Gunnar," he said, shaking his head with a mix of exasperation and respect, "should have known what happened here." The 5 young men started talking at once, their stories contradictory and slurred. But Gunnar simply pointed to the bowling alley wall. "Security camera," he said, "right there." Tom looked up at the camera, then at the 5 men, then back at Gunnar and Sarah. "Right. Well then, let's have a look at that footage, shall we?" Inside the bowling alley, the manager, a woman named Betty who'd run the place for 30 years, queued up the security footage. It showed everything. The men blocking Sarah's path, the grab, the shove, the knife. Tom watched it twice, his expression growing harder with each viewing. He turned to the 5 young men who'd been brought inside. "Tyler Morgan," he said, addressing the tall one. "That's assault, and pulling a knife." He shook his head. "That's assault with a deadly weapon. You know whose son you are. You know how disappointed your daddy's going to be." Tyler's face went pale. "Officer Bradley, please, I was just—" "Just what? Just drunk, just stupid." Tom cut him off. He looked at the other 4. "And you, every one of you is looking at charges, public intoxication at minimum, possibly assault as accomplices." While Tom read them their rights and called for backup, Gunnar helped Sarah gather her scattered groceries. Most of the produce was ruined, crushed, or rolled into the gutter. "I'm Daniel Reeves," he said, introducing himself properly. "People call me Gunnar, retired Master Chief, Navy SEALs." Sarah looked up at him, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Sarah Mitchell, Lieutenant, retired, Navy SEALs." His eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be damned, should have known by the way you moved." He offered his hand and she shook it firmly. "Pleasure to meet you, Lieutenant." "Just Sarah now," she said. And thank you, I had it under control, but 5-on-1 is never good odds, no matter how well trained you are, he finished. Especially when they're drunk and stupid. Part 3. An hour later, Sarah sat in the Riverside Police Department, an ice pack on her leg, giving her statement. Officer Bradley had been thorough and professional, but she could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Those boys have been trouble for months," Tom said, setting down his pen. "Tyler Morgan and his crew think because Tyler's dad owns half the county, they can do whatever they want. This is the first time we've got them on camera, though. First time we've got real evidence." Gunnar sat in the chair beside her, having already given his own statement. "What'll happen to them?" he asked. Tom sighed. "Honestly, if this was anyone else, I'd say they'd see real consequences. But John Morgan, Tyler's father, he's got money and lawyers. He sits on the town council. He golfs with the mayor." He looked at Sarah, apology in his eyes. "I'll do everything by the book, ma'am, but I want you to be prepared. Men like that, they have ways of making things go away." Sarah felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest. She'd felt it before, during her years in service. The times when being a woman meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. The times when the rules seemed to bend for some people but not for others. "The law is the law," she said quietly. "Right." Tom met her eyes. "Should be. Doesn't always work that way in small towns." Over the next few days, Sarah learned just how right Tom had been. The local newspaper, the Riverside Chronicle, ran a story about the incident. But the headline wasn't what she expected. "Altercation outside bowling alley results in injuries to local youth." The article barely mentioned the attack. Instead, it focused on how 5 young men had been roughed up by 2 individuals with military training. It quoted Tyler's father, John Morgan, expressing his concern about excessive force and vigilante justice. Sarah read the article in her small rental house, her hands shaking with anger. Emma, her 16-year-old daughter, sat beside her on the couch. "That's not what happened," Emma said, her voice tight. "Mom, that's not what happened at all." "I know, honey. They attacked you. Why is the newspaper lying?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Because sometimes people with power use it to protect their own, even when their own are in the wrong." The phone rang. It was Gunnar. "Did you see the paper?" he asked without preamble. "Yeah. We need to fight this. We can't let them control the narrative." Sarah appreciated his anger on her behalf, but she was tired. Her leg hurt. Her daughter was upset, and she'd fought enough battles for one lifetime. "What do you suggest?" "Town council meets tomorrow night. It's open to the public. We go, we speak. We make sure people know what really happened." The next evening, Sarah walked into the Riverside Town Hall with Gunnar at her side. The council chamber was fuller than usual. Word had spread about the incident, and people were curious. John Morgan sat at the council table, a large man with silver hair and an expensive suit. When he saw Sarah enter, his expression hardened. The meeting began with routine business, budget discussions, zoning applications, permit approvals. Sarah waited, her heart pounding. When they reached the public comment section, she stood. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, walking to the microphone at the front of the room. 2 weeks ago, I was attacked by 5 men outside the bowling alley on Maple Street. I'm here tonight because the newspaper article about that incident was inaccurate and misleading." John Morgan leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, this is not the appropriate forum for—" "With respect, Councilman Morgan, this is exactly the appropriate forum. This is where citizens speak to their elected officials about matters of public concern." Sarah kept her voice level, professional. "Your son and his friends assaulted me. They blocked my path, grabbed me, shoved me, and pulled a knife. All of this is on video, but the newspaper made it sound like I was the aggressor." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. John Morgan's face reddened. "My son made a mistake. He's apologized. but you and your friend put him in the hospital with bruised ribs and a sprained wrist. I defended myself against 5 attackers, one of whom was armed, Sarah said calmly. I used the minimum force necessary to ensure my safety. You're a trained killer, Morgan's voice rose. You could have killed those boys. The room went silent. Sarah felt every eye on her. Yes, she said softly, I am trained. I spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL. I've served my country in ways that most people can't imagine. And yes, I could have seriously hurt your son and his friends, but I didn't. Because despite what you seem to think, I'm not a monster. I'm a woman who wanted to walk home with her groceries without being attacked. The silence in the town hall stretched for several long seconds. Then, from the back of the room, someone started clapping. It was Betty, the bowling alley manager. Others joined in. Not everyone, but enough. John Morgan's face had gone from red to purple. You people don't understand, he said, standing up from the council table. This woman is dangerous. She and that man, he pointed at Gunnar. They assaulted 5 young men who'd had a few drinks. They could have shown restraint. They could have walked away. Gunnar stood. Councilman Morgan, with all due respect, your son grabbed Lieutenant Mitchell. He shoved her. He pulled a knife. At what point exactly should she have walked away? She could have called the police. With 5 men surrounding her, one armed, Gunnar's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Sir, I don't think you understand how assault works. Your son wasn't making suggestions. He wasn't asking for a date. He was committing a violent crime. Mayor Patricia Henderson, a thin woman in her 60s who'd been watching the exchange with sharp eyes, spoke up. John, I've seen the video. Tom Bradley showed it to all of us. Your boy is in the wrong here. Morgan turned to her. Patricia, these are good kids who made one mistake. They pulled a knife on a woman carrying groceries, the mayor said flatly. That's not a mistake. That's a crime. And if you think this council is going to sweep it under the rug because you write big checks to the annual fundraiser, you're mistaken. The room erupted. Half the people were on their feet, some shouting support for the mayor, others for Morgan. Sarah stood at the microphone, watching it all unfold, feeling oddly detached. This was what she'd left the military to escape: the politics, the power games, the way truth became flexible depending on who was telling the story. But Emma was in the audience, sitting in the 3rd row, watching her mother stand up for what was right. That mattered more than her own weariness. When the noise died down, Tom Bradley stood. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner. If I may, he said, we've charged all 5 young men. Tyler Morgan is facing assault with a deadly weapon. The others are facing assault and public intoxication. The district attorney has reviewed the evidence and believes we have a strong case. The DA is up for re-election next year, Morgan said quickly. He's playing politics. No, Tom said firmly. He's doing his job, and so am I. The meeting ended in chaos. Some people wanted to speak with Sarah, to thank her, to tell her they supported her. Others glared at her as they left, clearly siding with Morgan and his money. Outside in the parking lot, a group had gathered around Sarah's car. She tensed, then relaxed when she saw they were friendly faces. Betty was there, along with several other women from town. We wanted you to know, Betty said, that not everyone here thinks money is more important than justice. Some of us still remember what's right and what's wrong. An older man stepped forward. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap. Thank you for your service, ma'am, he said, saluting, and thank you for standing up tonight. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She saluted back. Thank you, sir. But as she drove home with Emma, her daughter asked the question that had been nagging at Sarah all evening. Mom, what if Mr. Morgan's right? What if his lawyers make this all go away? Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. 3 weeks later, they got their answer. The charges against Tyler Morgan were reduced to simple assault, a misdemeanor. His friends got off with community service and probation. Tyler himself received a $500 fine and 6 months of probation. No jail time, no real consequences. Sarah read the news on her phone while sitting in her living room. Gunnar had called to tell her, his voice tight with anger, but she'd already seen it online. Emma was at school. The house was quiet. Sarah sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of disappointment settle over her like a heavy blanket. She'd fought for her country. She'd bled for it. She'd lost friends, good people, warriors who deserved better than the world gave them. And now she couldn't even walk down a street in her own town without being attacked. And when she defended herself, the attackers got a slap on the wrist because their fathers had money. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Should have screamed louder, whore. Then another, you think you're so tough. Wait till we see you again. Then another, military trash. Go back where you came from. Sarah's hands shook as she blocked the numbers, but more messages came from different numbers. They knew where she lived. They knew Emma's school. She called Tom Bradley. He came to her house within the hour, his face grim as he reviewed the messages. I'll trace these, he said. This is harassment, possibly criminal threats. But Sarah, he hesitated. John Morgan has made it clear that he considers this matter closed. He's got the ear of the DA, the mayor. If you push this, if you try to press more charges, you're going to make powerful enemies in this town. I already have powerful enemies, Sarah said quietly. True, but it could get worse for you, for Emma. Sarah looked at him. What are you suggesting? That I just accept this? That I let them threaten me and my daughter? I'm suggesting you be smart, document everything, but also maybe think about whether Riverside is the right place for you. After he left, Sarah sat in her living room for a long time thinking. She'd survived Bud-S training, one of the hardest military programs in the world. She'd survived combat. She'd survived losing friends, sustaining injuries, fighting in a world that didn't always want women fighting beside men. But this felt different. This felt like losing. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her front yard vandalized. Someone had spray-painted words across her garage door, leave and not welcome. Her car's tires had been slashed. Emma came downstairs, saw her mother standing in the driveway, and started crying. Pack a bag, Sarah said. You're staying with Aunt Jennifer for a few days. Mom, no, I'm not leaving you here alone. Emma, this isn't a debate. I need to know you're safe. That afternoon, after dropping Emma at her sister's house 2 towns over, Sarah returned home to find Gunnar sitting on her front steps. Heard what happened, he said. This has gone too far. You think I don't know that? Sarah's voice was sharp with frustration and fear. Tom Bradley basically told me to leave town. The people who attacked me got away with it, and now they're coming after me again. Gunnar stood. I've been making some calls, reaching out to old contacts. The thing about the Navy SEAL community, we take care of our own, and it turns out we've got friends in interesting places. What are you talking about? Do you know who owns the Riverside Chronicle, the newspaper that ran that biased story? Gunnar pulled out his phone. Corporation called Morgan Media Holdings. 3 guesses who the primary shareholder is. Sarah felt her stomach drop. John Morgan owns the newspaper. Majority stake, which is why the story was slanted his way. But here's the interesting part. The Chronicle is struggling financially. They've been losing money for years. And Morgan Media Holdings has some very questionable tax practices. I know this because a friend of mine works for the IRS, and I asked him to take a look. Gunnar, what did you do? Nothing illegal, just made some calls, asked some questions. Turns out when you shine a light in dark corners, you find all sorts of interesting things. He smiled. Also turns out that Tyler Morgan's friends are starting to talk. When faced with real consequences, kids from wealthy families often decide loyalty isn't worth prison time. Over the next week, things began to unravel for the Morgan family in spectacular fashion. First, the IRS announced an audit of Morgan Media Holdings. The news broke on a Saturday, covered by every major outlet except, ironically, the Riverside Chronicle. Second, two of Tyler's friends, facing pressure from their own families, changed their statements. They admitted that Tyler had been the instigator, that he'd grabbed Sarah first, that he'd been the one to pull the knife. Their lawyers had advised them that accessory to assault with a deadly weapon was a serious charge, especially now that the story was getting regional attention. Third, and most importantly, a video surfaced. One of the bystanders that night had been recording on their phone from inside their car. The angle was different from the bowling alley security camera. This video clearly showed Tyler's face as he grabbed Sarah, as he shoved her, as he reached for his knife. It showed him laughing when his friends knocked over her groceries. It also had audio. The words he'd shouted, cruel, degrading words about what they were going to do to her, were crystal clear. The video went viral within hours of being posted online. By the next morning, it had millions of views. News outlets from Dallas, Houston, even national networks picked it up. Navy SEAL veteran attacked by group of men in small Texas town, read the CNN headline. Female veteran defends herself against armed attackers, faces backlash from local power players, wrote the Washington Post. Suddenly, Riverside, Texas was famous, and John Morgan was at the center of it. The mayor called an emergency town council meeting. John Morgan didn't attend. The district attorney has agreed to reopen the case, Mayor Henderson announced to a packed room. New charges will be filed based on the additional evidence. Tyler Morgan will face felony assault charges. His accomplices will face appropriate charges as well. She looked directly at Sarah, who sat in the front row with Gunnar beside her. On behalf of the town of Riverside, I apologize to Ms. Mitchell. What happened to her was wrong. Our initial response was inadequate. That changes now. The room erupted in applause. Tom Bradley approached Sarah after the meeting. Morgan's resigned from the council, he said. The newspaper's been sold to an independent media company, and the DA wants to talk to you about testifying. Sarah nodded, taking it all in. What changed, she asked. Why now? Public pressure, media attention, but honestly, Tom smiled. I think people just needed to see the truth. Once they did, they couldn't ignore it anymore. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a courtroom as a judge sentenced Tyler Morgan to 2 years in prison for felony assault. His friends received lesser sentences, but all would have criminal records. John Morgan sat in the gallery, his empire crumbling around him. The IRS audit had revealed massive tax evasion. He was facing his own criminal charges. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Sarah. She gave a brief statement. I hope this sends a message that no one is above the law, not in small towns, not anywhere. And I hope it reminds people that veterans, male or female, deserve respect, not just for our service but because we're human beings. Gunnar stood beside her as he had throughout the entire ordeal. What's next for you? A reporter asked. Sarah smiled. I'm staying in Riverside. It's my home now, and I've been asked to teach self-defense classes at the community center specifically for women. Turns out there's a real need for that. Emma joined her mother, slipping her hand into Sarah's. I'm proud of you, Mom, she whispered. As they walked away from the courthouse, through the crowd of supporters who'd gathered, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She'd fought and won, not with violence, though she'd been prepared to defend herself, not with political power because she had none, but with the truth, with persistence, and with the support of good people who refused to let injustice stand. That evening, back at home, Sarah received an email. It was from a national advocacy group for female veterans. They wanted her to speak at their conference, to share her story, to help other women who faced similar situations. She read it twice, then looked at Emma, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. "Mom," Emma asked, noticing her expression, "everything okay?" Sarah smiled. "Yeah, honey, everything's going to be just fine." She'd been a Navy SEAL. She'd served her country in the hardest ways possible. And now she was serving it again in a different way, by standing up, by refusing to be silenced, by showing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply tell the truth and wait for the world to catch up. Gunnar called that night. "Saw you on the news," he said. "You did good, Lieutenant." "We did good, Master Chief," she corrected. "Couldn't have done it without you." That's what teammates are for. Sarah looked out her window at the quiet street, at the neighbors who now waved when they saw her, at the town that had finally chosen justice over power. She'd found something in Riverside after all, not just a home but a purpose, and sometimes that was worth fighting for.